Million individuals committed to the end of the persistence of hunger are honored to present, live from Lusaka, Zambia, and from United Nations headquarters in New York, the announcement of the second annual Africa Prize for Leadership for the Sustainable End of Hunger.
Your Excellency the President of the Republic of Zambia and the rest, please remain seated. We've still got a few minutes before we cross over to New York. I'd like to invite the President perhaps to lead us into that famous song before we join the rest of the world for this important cause. Your Excellency, please.
Tiende pamozi ndi mtima umo. Tiende pamozi ndi mtima umo.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. Your Excellency, the President, Madam Executive Director, Ms. John Holmes, honorable members of the Senate Committee, ministers, Your Excellencies, friends of Africa around the world, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I welcome you all to the announcement of the winner of the second annual Africa Prize for Leadership for the Sustainable End of Hunger. My name is Frank Mutubila from the Zambian National Broadcasting Corporation. I'm honored to have the opportunity of welcoming you to this historic announcement, to this unprecedented worldwide telecast, and to this historical day for the future of Africa, a hunger-free Africa. I'm very pleased to introduce our first speaker today, the chairman of the Hunger Project in Zambia, Mr. Mark Chona. A big hand, please.
Your Excellency, the President of the Republic of Zambia, Madam Executive Director, the Right Honorable Prime Minister, the Honorable Chief Justice, members of the Central Committee, Honorable Ministers, distinguished guests, Excellencies, friends and partners of the Hunger Project around the world. I want to welcome each and every one of you, first on the behalf of the international jury of the Africa Prize for Leadership. I know for myself, even as one who has had opportunity firsthand to see African leadership in action, it has been a real opener to observe as a juror the enormous wealth of talented, committed leadership that is emerging across this continent from the dark cloud that has covered its past. I'd also like to welcome you on behalf of the Hunger Project in Zambia. Here in Zambia, we have the youngest hunger project in the world, but one that is fully ready with you to end hunger in our motherland and around the world. Finally, I would like to welcome you on behalf of the Hunger Project around the world, committed to positive, creative conversation and enduring partnership. Here in Lusaka, we are some 500 individuals, including distinguished leaders of our party and government, leaders of Zambia's vital non-governmental organizations, members of the diplomatic corps, leaders of the church, members of the farming, business, and financial community, representatives of the mass media, and many supporters of the Hunger Project. From this, we are linked today in this announcement to our colleagues in the Hunger Project in the 17 countries in the world and around the world, and staff and volunteers of the Hunger Project have organized events in more than 100 cities, invited other supporters of the future of Africa to join them. In Tokyo, it's just after midnight, yet dozens have assembled to listen to us today. We are meeting with our partners and supporters in Auckland, New Zealand, New Delhi, Bangalore, Bombay, Munich, Geneva, Stockholm, London, Toronto, Ottawa, Los Angeles, Kansas City, Nairobi, Harare, to name just a few. Ambassadors, including some Zambian missions, are co-hosting this event. At the United Nations headquarters in New York, hundreds have gathered this moment with the chairman of our international jury, the Honorable Bradford Moss, a man whose profound feelings for and vision of Africa and the third world in general give us so much hope for the future of the human race. At UCLA, we are meeting with the African Studies Center, and in Washington, D.C., we are meeting supporters at AfriCare and Capitol Hill. Across North America, hundreds of thousands are viewing this announcement now live on cable television's Learning Channel. And we will perhaps be learning about Africa's promising future for the very first time. So I'd like to make a few comments to you for a moment about the impact the Africa Prize for Leadership is having here in Africa. For us, the Africa Prize is achieving several important objectives. First, the prize is generating and encouraging new international support for those leaders and their organizations decisively engaged in the fight against hunger in all its manifestations. The International Center of Insect Physiology and Ecology, where last year's co-winner Professor Thomas Odhiambo is the director, reports that the Africa Prize has put it on the map in a way it never was before. The multiplier effect of its work fuels the efforts of men and women engaged in research to improve the quality of life in Africa. Second, those of us in Africa who are committed to ending hunger have found in the Africa Prize a new creative tool to more sharply focus attention on what we individually and collectively can do to stop the persistence of hunger. The Africa Prize is a powerful catalyst in the creation of a new vision of Africa and the motive force in generating the combative spirit to accomplish the goals set in that vision. Third, like the Nobel Prize and the Olympics, the Africa Prize is setting a new standard of excellence, an inspiration to youth, and in the words of last year's co-winner, President Abdou Diouf of Senegal, a real source of encouragement for the hard-working African leaders and their people. As Archbishop Desmond Tutu said in his message to the Africa Prize ceremony last year, I hope this award may become a springboard to stability and peace in a continent racked by hunger and despair. The prize is a call to action by those who deserve recognition and honor for their worthy contribution to human development. Now, apart from the Nobel Prize and the Olympic medals, there is the Africa Prize to work for in the interests of society. For us in Zambia, the price of failure to act is unveiled in the indicting figures under current conditions. If the infant mortality rate remains at 87 per thousand, as it is now, and if daily toll of 200 from the hunger project, from the hunger-related diseases is not reduced, about 1 million Zambians, most of them children, will die in the remaining 137 months before the year 2000. These figures are indeed horrifying and cannot be ignored. Just pause and think. In the next 11.5 years, 1 million Zambians will die needlessly. They will join millions of others whose graves litter our burial grounds in the country, from causes we have the capacity and capability to prevent. We know that the death toll in some countries will be worse than ours, but this is no comfort to us. It must touch our hearts and make us pledge to act with urgency. This crisis is very grave. Hunger is a real enemy. Nothing so far equals it in its destructive capacity. We indeed need total mobilization of all the resources and all the forces. Massive, decisive frontal attack on this enemy is absolutely necessary. This is a war. And those who give bold, courageous, and targeted leadership on a sustainable basis deserving acknowledgement and honor. The Africa Prize needs global support to stimulate local commitment and initiative and empower those who are in a position to make the difference. We in Zambia must establish national prize for leadership to end hunger. Let us at the same time strengthen any other efforts by any other individuals and organizations to end this devastation. We truly are in a race against time. Time to save those who deserve to live and contribute to national growth and power. Let us remember and honor the dead by helping the living. I ask for your commitment. I ask for your support. I know, with the challenge now standing in clear vision, your conscience and mine will move us to action. Together, united in spirit, united in our purpose, united in our commitment, we will bury hunger in its own burial grounds, impact ignorance and poverty, and open a new era of opportunity. It's now my privilege and honor to introduce our next speaker, Joan Holmes. She has been Executive Director of the Hunger Project since it began in 1977. She has courageously and consistently led the way and the efforts worldwide to end the persistence of hunger. She has served as on the Executive Committee of Interaction and American Council of Voluntary International Action. She serves as a trustee of International Development Conference, as a Director of Overseas Development Council, and a member of the Advisory Council on Voluntary Foreign Aid. In her role with the Hunger Project, Ms. Holmes has traveled widely in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and Europe. She directed and managed the launching of the Hunger Project in India, where by now there are more than 800,000 individuals enrolled in the commitment to end hunger. Worldwide, Joan Holmes' leadership, the Hunger Project has enrolled 5.4 million individuals from 152 countries. Ms. Holmes has long-standing commitment to Africa. It is my real honor and privilege, ladies and gentlemen, to introduce a passionate, articulate voice for Africa, and Africa without hunger, a prosperous Africa, Ms. Joan Holmes.
Mr. President, Mr. Prime Minister, honorable ministers, your excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I am honored to be here in Zambia. Thank you, Mr. President, for making Lusaka available to announce this year's winner of the Africa Prize for Leadership. I'm proud to be here with Mark Chona, Dr. Joseph Temba, and the rest of my colleagues in the Hunger Project in Zambia, men and women who have courageously taken a stand for the end of hunger. I warmly recall my first visit to Zambia with Mr. Wayne Fredericks. It was on that visit to the southern and eastern countries in Africa that the idea for the Africa Prize for Leadership began to take shape. As I was preparing my remarks for this new conference, I was reflecting on the fact that exhibiting leadership anywhere in the world is rare. In Africa, given the difficulties and the harsh realities, exhibiting leadership takes an extraordinary amount of courage, vision, commitment, dedication, and a powerful sense of purpose. Reflecting on leadership, I came to say that true leadership is only necessary when you need to accomplish something and there is not a clear pathway to that accomplishment. It is in the very essence of leadership to call forth a new future, a future that takes into account existing circumstances but goes beyond them. This is a future that is not predictable. It is a future that is created out of courage and out of vision. I can well imagine, Mr. President, that when you and your fellow freedom fighters first took a stand for free Africa, there was no clear-cut pathway to that accomplishment. I dare say that most people said it was impossible. And yet, with your boldness, with your courage, with your vision, today, more than 500 million people live in a free Africa. That's the kind of leadership that's now necessary for the end of hunger. Hunger is humanity's oldest and most tragic problem. Hunger takes the lives of 13 to 18 million people every year, year in and year out. 32,000 of us die of the persistence of hunger each and every day. 3/4 of these deaths are children under the age of 5. Every minute of every day, 18 children die needlessly of the consequence of hunger. Imagine 100 jumbo jets, each filled with 260 children. Now imagine those 100 jumbo jets crashing. Hunger kills that number of children each and every day. We don't build memorials to remind us, but the fact is that the number of people who have died from hunger and starvation in the last 5 years is more than all those people killed in World War I and World War II combined. 25% of the remaining hunger and starvation is on the African continent. Well, most of us have found a way to avoid confronting it in our daily lives. It is clear that no other disaster is as devastating to the quality of life on our planet. There is now a consensus among experts that for the first time in the history of the world, the end of hunger is achievable. There's also a consensus that bold, courageous, committed leadership is the key ingredient to the end of hunger. Nigeria's former head of state, General Obasanjo, has said, Africans themselves have the responsibility for eliminating hunger from this continent. African leaders must lead the way in this and provide the example. African leaders who are imbued with vision, a sense of mission, human understanding, and a total commitment to the welfare of their people. This is the type of leadership that is needed to end hunger in Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, the Hunger Project created the Africa Prize for Leadership to have recognition of and support for dynamic and effective leadership for the end of hunger. Such support is truly necessary. At the most basic level, Africa suffers from a lack of recognition. Within the international community and the media, there is an unbalanced focus on failures and difficulties. We are not informed about the achievements, about the many men and women who are transforming the difficulties into challenges that can be and are being met. The fact is, there's a new spirit of leadership emerging on the African continent. This leadership can be found at every kind of level. Grassroots leaders who are fostering a newfound spirit of cooperation and collaboration. In 1986, I had the opportunity of meeting with Robinson Gapari. He is the founder and the president of Africa's largest farmers' union, over 400,000 farmers in Zimbabwe. He's been a farmer and worked with farmers for over 30 years. He said that the farmers in Africa have the spirit, have the know-how, have the creativity, and when they are empowered with effective policies, that this continent will be second to none in its agricultural productivity. There's leadership in the business and financial arena. Researchers and scientists are working together to tackle the complex issues of sustainable development. I met with Professor Thomas Odhiambo, one of the 1987 Africa Prize winners, the very week he was founding the Africa Academy of Sciences. In talking about science in Africa, he said, no matter how much wisdom we import from the outside, it is insufficient. What is needed now are African solutions to African problems. And perhaps most importantly, there's leadership in the political arena. Leaders who have the political courage to create policy environments that support the creative and innovative energies of the African people. The Africa Prize for Leadership intends to acknowledge this new spirit of leadership. By awarding this prize, we intend to create a new opportunity for the world community to relate to Africa not solely as a continent of problems and difficulties and crises, but also as a continent of extraordinary capacity, promise, and possibility. The prize was created not only to acknowledge what has been accomplished, but what can be accomplished. The prize was created to create new openings for leaders to take bold, inventive, courageous actions for the end of hunger. President Diouf of Senegal, a co-recipient of the Africa Prize in 1987, has taken such an inventive action. Using the money he was awarded, President Diouf has established a presidential award for farmers. Farmers who, by the use of fertilizers, expand agricultural production and increase food self-sufficiency in his country. As you yourself have said, Mr. President, hunger and its eradication is not a problem of some nations and not of others. A child who cries out in hunger does not do so as a Somali, as an American, as an Indian. The child who cries out in hunger cries out as a human being. The persistence of hunger is a fundamental human issue at the very heart, the very wellspring of who we are. The end of hunger will take the participation of all of us, individuals, agencies, and governments around the world. Those of us in the international community can contribute to the end of hunger in Africa. At the same time, we must recognize that it is African leaders who will pave the way, African leaders who will chart the future and create the inspiration, African leaders who will engender a new sense of purpose. It is African leaders who will call forth the end of hunger in Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, the Africa Prize for Leadership was created to honor those bold, committed, courageous African leaders. I thank you.
Mr. President, Mr. Prime Minister, Joan Holmes, Ambassador Chona, ladies and gentlemen, greetings from the United Nations headquarters in New York City. My name is Dr. Peter Bourne. I'm a member of the Hunger Project's Global Board of Directors, and I'm honored to be the moderator for today's event here at the United Nations. To announce this year's winner of the Africa Prize for Leadership for the sustainable end of hunger, we are privileged to have with us today the Honourable Bradford Morse, the chairman of the Africa Prize International Jury. The Hunger Project is delighted to have as jury chairman a distinguished public servant and leader in his own right, who is known throughout the world as a humanitarian, statesman, and peacemaker, as well as a good and admired personal friend of so many of us. As a former United States congressman, as administrator of the United Nations Development Program for more than a decade, and as president of the Salzburg Seminar, Mr. Morse's life epitomizes the highest levels of public service and achievement in government, in private institutions, and in the United Nations. He's long been a persistent and articulate champion of a world without hunger. As many of us here today know from personal experience, Brad has friends and admirers all around the world, but nowhere more so than in Africa. He has had a long-standing commitment to the African continent and to the well-being of its people. In 1974, at the time of drought and famine in West Africa, Mr. Morse built an institution, the United Nations Sahelian Office, to underpin efforts to end the persistence of hunger in Africa. As administrator of the UN Development Program, where I was privileged to serve with him, he directed efforts to improve the production, processing, storage, marketing and distribution of food in some 1,000 projects, many of them in Africa. And in 1985, he was personally asked by the United Nations Secretary General to coordinate and direct the relief and rehabilitation activities of the United Nations system in support of the efforts of African countries affected by the drought. As head of the UN Office for Emergency Operations in Africa, Mr. Morse secured the cooperation of NGOs and governments, and in the face of extraordinarily difficult circumstances, he successfully coordinated the world's response to the African famine. In recognition of his lifelong commitment to public service and in acknowledgement of his numerous extraordinary contributions to humanity, in 1985, Brad Morse received the U.S. Presidential Award for a World Without Hunger for outstanding individual achievement. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to introduce someone I am privileged to call a close personal friend, Mr. Bradford Morse.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much, Peter Bourne. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen. And thank you, friends of Africa around the world. The leadership for solving Africa's problems can come only from Africans themselves. It is up to those of us from other parts of the world who are committed to Africa's future to support those Africans who have demonstrated the courage, the initiative to provide the necessary leadership for the task. It is for this purpose that we're here today. I'd first like to acknowledge my esteemed and distinguished colleagues on the jury, Dame Nita Barrow, who's with us here today. She's the permanent representative of Barbados to the United Nations, and among her other notable achievements, she's worked courageously against apartheid as a member of the Commonwealth Group of Eminent Persons. Dr. Norman Borlaug, the distinguished Nobel laureate, who today works tirelessly to transfer the Green Revolution, his Green Revolution, to poor farmers throughout the world. Dr. Mark Chona, whose words have just moved all of us from Zambia. Ide Umaru, the Secretary General of the Organization of African Unity and former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Niger and a close personal friend. Dr. M.S. Swaminathan, the President of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature and Natural Resources, and the father of the Green Revolution in India. The jurors have had a very difficult task. The importance of leadership in the war against hunger on the African continent is now being recognized increasingly. We received twice as many nominations this year as we did in 1987, with 4 times as many nominations coming from the African continent itself. Nominations have been received from heads of state, from ministers of government, from scholars, from heads of international organizations, as well as from farmers, from peasant organizations. Most of those nominated are fully worthy of the award. They've demonstrated a range of leadership necessary for the sustainable end of hunger. They include scientists and educators, leaders of peasant movements, leaders of non-governmental organizations, leaders of intergovernmental organizations, and individuals whose leadership has inspired tremendous achievements in motivating and enabling Africans to grow more food, to resist and reverse the march of the desert, to preserve and expand their forests, to provide education, health, and hope. One of the major intellectual forces on the African continent. Having led his people through their painful struggle for independence, he is succeeding in bringing peace and prosperity to them. He's established policies which have made his country's agriculture one of the most impressive success stories of the continent. Thanks to his vision, to his wisdom and his policies, small farmers have increased their crop revenues tenfold. They've increased their share of total agricultural production from 10% in 1980 to 64% today. They now receive 18 times more farm loans than a decade ago. Our laureate has worked tirelessly to advance racial harmony in his country following its long and violent struggle for independence. And his leadership has enabled the black majority to achieve rapid economic gains, yet it has retained the talents and the productivity of the white minority. In addition to his national leadership, he plays a vital regional role in Southern Africa, and he's a global figure whose leadership is pivotal this year as chairman of the Non-Aligned Movement. I am pleased to announce the winner of the 1988 Africa Prize for Leadership, His Excellency Robert Gabriel Mugabe, President of the Republic of Zimbabwe. Excuse me. Forgive me, Mr. President. Robert Mugabe is an extraordinary leader. He has pioneered policies which have energized his people to win their struggle against poverty and hunger, policies which point the way to peace and successful social and economic development across the continent. Small and communal farming have been strengthened by policies which have produced higher producer prices, land reform, credit programs, extension programs, and improved infrastructure. Women who perform 2/3 of the agricultural work now have equal rights to land, to agricultural training, and credit. In addition to the miracle of Zimbabwe's agriculture, public health and education have also vastly improved. The infant mortality rate has dropped in Zimbabwe from 121 per thousand to 76 today. Primary school enrollment has tripled. Secondary school enrollment has increased 5-fold. In honoring Robert Mugabe, we honor not only the achievements of one individual, but the aspirations and attainments of the entire Zimbabwean people, and the creativity, the determination, and the accomplishments of all Africans. But it is we who are truly honored to be in partnership with the African people in their quest for a future of opportunity, a future free of hunger. I offer my profound congratulations to His Excellency, President Robert Mugabe. It is now my high privilege to introduce one of Africa's senior statesmen and one of the world's great leaders. Kenneth David Kaunda led his country to independence and became its first president in 1964. He is truly one of the great founding fathers of free Africa. Consistently the champion of freedom, he is an outspoken leader of the frontline states in the unyielding struggle against apartheid. Dr. Kaunda's personal commitment to human rights and to the dignity of each human being has been translated into Zambia's national philosophy of humanism, which condemns the exploitation of man by man. A firm believer in the Organization of African Unity, he has always upheld its principles. As its chairman in 1970 and 1987, he carried his dynamic endeavors for peace in Southern Africa to the entire continent. He richly deserves his reputation as a prophet of peace. Dr. Kaunda has long worked for a new, harmonized set of international relationships in which expanded free trade may be conducted between the developed and developing countries. Dr. Kaunda's love of Africa, his leadership, and his vision for the future have inspired the world. I've been privileged to know Dr. Kaunda for many years, and my life is richer for it. It is my very great honor to present His Excellency, Dr. Kenneth David Kaunda.
Madam Executive Director John Holmes, our local chairman, Mark Chona, my colleagues and comrades in the leadership of the parent government of Zambia, distinguished guests, excellencies, supporters and friends of the Hunger Project worldwide, brothers and sisters. It is a singular honor to have been invited to participate in the important proceedings of this evening organized by the Hunger Project of Zambia, at which the 1988 winner of the Africa Prize for Leadership for the Sustainable End to Hunger has been announced simultaneously in New York and here in Zambia. I therefore must begin by congratulating my colleague, close colleague and comrade in arms, Robert Gabriel Mugabe, a truly gallant freedom fighter. He fought exploitation of man by man on the basis of deep-rooted principles. Once he won his struggle, he embraced all, including the one who considered himself his arch-enemy, Ian Douglas Smith. A truly great soul. So we said to you, Robert Gabriel Mugabe, as your middle name indicates, Gabriel Angel, you truly are an angel. We say, please carry on, don't delay. May I also congratulate and thank the Hunger Project for this very important initiative. We must focus on correcting the mistakes of the past, but we must also acknowledge our accomplishments. To those here from the Zambian, Kenyan, and Global Hunger Projects, and to their colleagues listening in around the world, please let me assure you that your work to build greater understanding and solidarity between Africans and their fellow men in the rest of the world is greatly appreciated by Africa and is a benefit to all humanity. It augurs well for the future. It augurs well for the future. At a crucial point in Africa's development, the Africa Prize is calling the world's attention to the vital importance of leadership in Africa and to the commitment and contributions that African leaders are making to the economic and social advancement of their people. The prize also helps to focus our effort on ending hunger. This silent emergency at the center of action. Thus, today's Africa Prize, while it acknowledges a single individual, is also a testament to the courage and creativity of Africa's food farmers and emergent entrepreneurs. It must spur them. It must spur them levels of achievement. Ever since the creation, man has faced many problems and calamities. But perhaps none has been so agonizing and inflicted so much suffering and hardship on millions of people as hunger. The irony, however, is that from a global point of view, there should in fact be no hunger in the world. Not only is enough food being produced in the world to feed everybody, but the world has enough resources and means to exploit them that man should not be afflicted by hunger. Madam Executive Director, our local chairman, yet over 100 million people are presently acutely malnourished, and more than 50 million die of hunger every year, of which as many as 20 million are children, God's most precious gems. This is the challenge of our era. This is the challenge of our era, where even as we are gathered here, as much as 40% of the world's population is still struggling at the age of starvation. The African continent, and the sub-Saharan region in particular, has, in the eyes of the world, conjured up only visions of poverty, hunger, and generally backwardness. The region has and continues to face problems of floods, droughts, desertification, locusts, and a whole host of problems which year in and year out have worked to undermine the efforts of governments and their people to produce enough food and establish a stable base of food security. But Africa must not lose hope and must not despair. The problems that Africa has faced over the centuries and the adverse conditions, both local and international, within which she has had to struggle, only serve to demonstrate and confirm the resilience, courage, and enduring spirit and determination of the African people. The African struggle has always been a struggle for survival. Nature has, on the other hand, been kind to Africa. She has blessed Africa with abundant natural resources to which Africa must now direct her energy and creativity to produce food and wealth. The war against hunger in Africa must be waged by Africa. The war against hunger in Africa must be waged by Africa. Africa must be in the forefront and must accept the prime responsibility of feeding herself, of saving the lives of millions of men, women, and children that die every year from hunger and malnutrition. Africa must rid herself of the scourge of poverty, which is the main cause of hunger, crime, ignorance, disease, and exploitation of man by man. But Madam Executive Director, Africa is not an island. Africa is not an island. She is part and parcel of the world and her people, members of the human family. It is therefore also the responsibility of the international community to assist and reinforce Africa's efforts to fight poverty and hunger. The elimination of hunger in the world is therefore our collective responsibility. Madam Executive Director, our local chairman, African agriculture, and that of developing countries in general, must be assisted in establishing a firm foundation, strong enough to insulate it from natural disasters such as droughts, floods, locusts, and also ensure that a fair and just international trade system is established. We cannot cross into the 21st century with an international trade order in which agricultural and primary exports of developing countries are subjected to fluctuating and low prices in international markets, whilst prices of the items and goods that developed countries export and which developing countries need for their development are always rising, in which the system is characterized by quotas and protectionism, in which export earnings of developing countries continue to decline, whilst their debt obligations to their trading partners, especially to developed countries, continue to escalate. Exports of developing countries must be stabilized and afforded unimpeded access to markets of developed countries. Agricultural incomes and food prices must be stabilized. Mr. Chairman, having said this, it is only fair that I should acknowledge the assistance and support that Africa has enjoyed and continues to receive from the international community, countries and organizations in their efforts to fight poverty and hunger. The commendable efforts and programs of the organizations like the Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, International Fund for Agricultural Development, IFAD, World Bank, International Finance Corporation, IFC, not forgetting the Hunger Project, among other agencies, are praiseworthy. They have gone a long way to ease the sufferings of the people and to contribute to food production and agricultural development generally. But Africa is far from being self-sufficient in food production and still faces frequent threats of famine. However, the solution does not lie entirely in food aid to the hunger-stricken, no matter how commendable these actions are. Food aid, without assisting the people to improve their food production, equally leads to hunger. Where food donations are not part and parcel of a program to make a peasant farmer self-reliant in food production, they become a handicap rather than a help. We need to reach the right balance between food aid and self-reliance. Indeed, one is reminded of the old saying which states that, and I quote, "Give a man a bowl of food and he will eat for a day. But teach him to grow food and he will eat for a lifetime," end of quote. In the long run, we in Africa, the third world in general, must therefore stand on our own feet and we must feed ourselves. This is certainly the policy and strategy of the paternalist government here in Zambia, where every province is required to be self-sufficient in food production. In Africa, it must be recognized that the success of any plans aimed at ending hunger must take into account the roles played by small-scale farmers and women in food production. It is at this grassroots level that the success or failure of agricultural programs will be determined. In Zambia, the peasant sector comprises mainly of rural dwellers who cultivate a very limited number of hectares using simple technology and relying on family labor. This sector basically grows food crops and rears livestock to meet primary domestic requirements. The sector has great potential. The sector has great potential to contribute to the growth of the domestic economy if well-conceived programs and projects aimed at organizing this category of farmers can be put in place. Madam Executive Director, our local chairman, out of 600,000 family units involved in agricultural production in our country, 460,000, that is 77%, comprises of small-scale farmers. They produce all traditional crops such as sorghum, millet, and cassava. And along with emergent farmers, they contribute about 60% of marketed maize annually. They also contribute substantially to the production of livestock. The population of livestock held in the traditional sector is higher than in the commercial sector. It is also very important to point out that in Zambia, for instance, of the 460,000 family households of small-scale farmers in rural areas, 33% are headed by women. 33% are headed by women. The contribution of women to the growth of our rural economy is therefore considerable and commendable. Women not only contribute to agricultural production, but are also involved in the processing and marketing of food crops. This is the situation in most parts of Africa, where at the grassroots level, the burden of feeding the family and children, that is, the growing of food family, falls on women. Falls on women. The challenge before us, therefore, in the war against hunger and in our programs to increase food production in Africa lies in answering the question regarding the extent to which our range of agricultural programs and services effectively reach and involve.
This concludes the live teleconference from Lusaka and New York. The 1988 Africa Prize for Leadership will be presented at a black tie award ceremony in New York City on September 15th. For more information, contact the Hunger Project.
We also will be faxed a copy of his entire statement, and it will be available here very shortly. We now have a brief period in which Mr. Morse will be delighted to answer any questions that you might have about the award or about the winner. We've been asked for a copy of Mr. Morse's speech. I'm sure we can make that available to everybody as well. Yes, sir.